Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who's well known as someone who was a Muslim, became an atheist and is now a professing Christian, was asked once when she'd written a book calling for the Reformation of Islam, what that might look like. And the questioner said, we had a Reformation in the Christian church, and it was about sola scriptura. What happens if you go to sola scriptura in Islam? And she rather shockingly said, you end up with ISIS.
Well, Walid Ali, the well-known media figure and academic in Melbourne, once said that Islam's had its reformation and it's produced Al-Qaeda. That is, the idea of reform is to go back to your roots and to restore the roots. That's what the medieval idea was in the Christian church. And Islam has been going through that process, and it has produced Islamic radicalism. So it's really a very difficult thing to try and find kind of modernizing influences in the core texts of Islam that will counter the radical, violent themes. So, yeah, that's the challenge. Some people think of the Western Christian Reformation as a kind of softening of religion, a retreat of religion, but that's not what it was. It was a restoration of the role of the scriptures in faith and of the example of Christ. And when you restore Muhammad's standing and role and example in contemporary life, you don't get a kind of secularization of Islam, you get a radicalization of Islam.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why it doesn't really work is because, and this is another quite significant difference between Christianity and Islam, is Christianity really centers on the person of Jesus and your beliefs about him, but it's very principled. So the law, if you like, of Jesus is love. Love your neighbor, love God. And then you, in a sense, you work that out for your place, your culture. But Islam is very much an orthopraxic religion. You have to do these things. It's very practical. All you do is you follow the law, and the law is entirely comprehensive over almost every aspect of life. And Muhammad is the perfect example of what that looks like. He's the model practitioner of Islam. And so what you're doing is you're copying him. And so, as Mark says, what Reformation will look like is going back to following what Muhammad did, the way he ran the society, the way he lived his life, the way they did family, the way they did everything. And that looks a lot like 7th century Arabia, which doesn't look even slightly democratic or slightly modern. So it just doesn't work.
Richard, can I follow that for a moment? I know you both have interacted with vast numbers of Muslim people, and you've done so in a winsome and loving way. I think both of you deserve a great deal of credit for being deeply concerned to draw alongside Islamic people from what I know of your life and your works. And I've had the opportunity to talk to Mark at length about what he does over many decades, as I said in the introduction. Not so much you, Richard, but I know what you've been doing. It often strikes me that there must be many, many, good, decent Muslim people who are really worried about the radicalisation of their faith, reformation in one way, if you like, back to the basics, and what it means. How do good, decent Australian Muslims, for example, come to grips with the reality that, let's be frank about this, many Australians are becoming very worried about radical Islam in our midst?
Yeah, so it is certainly true that, again, like I said before, maybe only 25% of Muslims would be actively, conservatively wanting to impose Islam on people, or at least supporting that. I think the actual number of people who are working hard at it is much smaller. Maybe 2% are properly Islamist in an activist way, but 25% of people will support that project. But the remaining 75% of Muslims are very sensitive to that, and are very conscious of trying to, you might call them liberal, or at least certainly not Islamist, and they are trying to do a delicate dance of trying to be an Australian, trying to be a Muslim, trying to resist that radical shaping of their communities. But as we've just talked about, the problem is that they don't really have the support of their scriptures. Like, you can't argue for that based on Islam. You only really can argue for it based on practical, trying to get along with people in your society grounds. And so, yeah, they hope for that. Most Muslims don't want that, but they can't win that discussion because it doesn't actually fit with what their religion is teaching.
Muslims can experience quite a lot of cognitive dissonance. So you believe that Muhammad is the best example. So what your understanding of goodness is, you project on Muhammad. He must have been kind, he must have been wise and gentle and all these things that we admire, and loving. But the reality of the core texts of Islam are different. So sometimes when a society goes through a process of radicalizing because people want more Sharia, because they've been taught that Sharia is good, they're shocked at what that actually looks like, as happened in Iran. And so the cognitive dissonance is this gap between the core text and what I think Islam ought to be. And so that's why when some Muslims say Islam is peace, they're really very sincere in that. But do the core texts actually support that? If you Islamized society to restore the authority of the life of Muhammad, would that be the outcome? I don't think it would. So that's the great challenge really for Muslims. It's not easy being a Muslim.
Yeah, most Muslims don't know Islam. Most Muslims, their theological education, they go to Friday school, the equivalent of Sunday school at church, and that would be over by the time they're 12. Most of the thing they've been doing there is just memorizing the Quran in Arabic. They're not learning to think theologically. They're not reading anything other than the Quran. They're not reading their theologians. They're not reading. Most Muslims don't really know many of the traditions about Muhammad or the Hadith. They might know one or two of their favorite ones, but they know almost nothing about the person of Muhammad, the story of Islam, the details of what the theologians are actually saying. And I think Mark's right. They have an imagined Islam. They're told it's good, but they can't tell you why. They're told it's peaceful, but they can't base it on their texts.